The silence was absolute. In the small padded studio, the only sound that should exist was that of his own memories. Eduardo, the composer everyone called a genius, sat in his worn leather chair, staring at the piano keys with eyes full of frustration. He played in an almost ghostly manner, moving his fingers over the keys without hearing anything. Years ago, he had lost his hearing in an accident, but paradoxically, his ability to create melodies seemed to have intensified. He told people that he could hear with his mind, a skill that kept him in the spotlight of the music industry. That night, Eduardo was particularly restless. There was intense pressure to deliver a new composition to a major film studio, but the ideas just wouldn't come. The emptiness was uncomfortable, almost suffocating. He adjusted the small notebook on top of the piano, scratching down notes that made no sense as the tension tightened his chest. Then he stopped. There was something, not a real sound, but a vibrant sensation, almost like an echo coming from inside his head. Eduardo looked around the studio. It couldn't be. He was deaf. He tried to get back to work, but the feeling persisted. A new melody began to form in his mind, but it felt different. It was dissonant, a succession of strange notes that didn't connect. He squinted, trying to organize the sounds into something more coherent, but failed. The vibration grew. This time he felt it in the air as if something was moving around him. Eduardo felt a chill run up his spine. He stood up, walked over to the studio door and opened it slightly. The hallway was empty, lit by the dim light of a lamp that flickered occasionally. He returned to the piano, now with the feeling that he was no longer alone. The silence, which once had been a refuge, seemed to have gained weight. Eduardo sat back down at the piano, trying to push away the discomfort that was eating at him. The silence seemed less comforting now, and he could no longer focus. His mind kept returning to the strange sound he had heard, or rather, felt. As his fingers hesitated over the keys, the vibration returned, but this time with more intensity. It was a hum, low and pulsing, like an electric wire under tension. He instinctively pressed his hands to his ears, even though he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Suddenly, the hum changed. It became something more defined, an indistinct murmur that seemed to fill the space. Eduardo looked around the studio, trying to locate the source, but everything seemed normal. The vibration intensified, the sound growing like a wave, until he finally distinguished a voice. It was a female voice, soft and almost familiar, calling his name. Eduardo? His heart raced. He stood up abruptly, knocking the notebook to the floor. The sound stopped instantly, leaving only the suffocating silence. Breathless, he picked up the notebook and tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He decided to distract himself and went to get a glass of water in the kitchen next to the studio. But even away from the piano, the feeling of unease remained. It was as if the sound was trapped inside him, growing slowly, relentlessly. When he returned to the studio, a memory hit him like a punch. The voice he had heard seemed to belong to Clara, his former bandmate, whom he had abandoned years ago during a critical moment in their careers. Eduardo pushed the thought away, blaming his exhaustion for the association. He sat down again and tried to compose. But now, the sound had transformed into something even more disturbing. Words emerged from the murmurs, disjointed phrases, filled with pain and accusation. Clara's voice became clearer. "Why did you do this to me?" Eduardo stood up suddenly, knocking the chair over. He didn't want to hear any more. He couldn't hear any more. Yet, the silence seemed to have been replaced by something alive, something that was chasing him and wouldn't let him be. Eduardo felt like he was losing control. He needed an explanation, something to justify what was happening. Tiredness, he murmured to himself. It must be tiredness. He picked up his phone and opened the voice memo app, trying to record the sound, but as expected, the silence was absolute. Back at the piano, he tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. But as soon as he placed his fingers on the keys, the memories began to invade his mind. They weren't random thoughts. They came with voices, not just Clara's, but others as well. The childhood friend he had deceived to take credit for a song. The younger sister he had ignored during the toughest times in the family. Each memory felt alive, as if someone had projected them directly into his mind. He tried to get up, but the studio seemed different now. The light was dimmer, almost oppressive. One of the instruments, an old guitar hanging on the wall, emitted a muffled sound. Eduardo froze, his eyes fixed on the inanimate object. He approached slowly. The guitar seemed untouched, but when he placed his hand on it, he felt a wave of heat rise up his arm. And then the memory came. That was the guitar he had promised to return to a deceased friend, but had kept for himself, claiming it was a tribute. Now, the strings were vibrating faintly, even though no one was touching them. "This isn't real," he said, his voice trembling. "This can't be real." The whispers grew louder. Eduardo closed his eyes and pressed his hands against his ears, but the voices were inside him. "You betrayed us," they said in unison. "You abandoned us." In the midst of the chaos, he saw something shining in the corner of the room. A stack of old cassette tapes, covered in dust, caught his attention. He didn't remember seeing them before. Trembling, he picked up one of the tapes and placed it in the cassette player, curious and terrified at the same time. When he pressed play, the sound that emerged was the same he had been hearing. Murmurs, followed by familiar voices. But what made him recoil in horror was the last recorded phrase. "We're waiting for you, Eduardo." Eduardo stared at the tape player, his heart pounding as if it were about to explode. The recorded words seemed to echo through the studio, even though the sound had already ceased. He pressed the pause button, but it was as if the silence now carried the weight of the voices. Trying to compose himself, he picked up the guitar and placed it on the floor, as if moving it away would alleviate the pressure he felt. But there was no relief. Every object in the studio seemed to have a presence, as if they were watching his movements. He knew he wasn't alone, but he couldn't understand what exactly was there with him. That's when a long-buried memory surfaced. He was young, in a small studio similar to this one, arguing with a close friend, Andre. They were both partners and rivals in music, and Andre had always been one step ahead, in both talent and recognition. On a night of frustration, Eduardo sabotaged Andre's work by sending an incorrect version of a crucial composition to a producer. The mistake was disastrous for Andre, who lost his big opportunity and fell into a depression. Weeks later, he died in a car accident. Eduardo had always told himself it was a tragic coincidence, but now he wondered if that was the beginning of the burden he carried. "It was you," a voice said, clear and cold. Eduardo spun around, searching for the source, but the studio was empty. "You took everything from me," the voice continued. It was unmistakable, Andre. The memories of other mistakes and betrayals began to fill his mind like a chaotic mosaic. Every selfish decision, every abandonment, every lie, everything came rushing back to him now. Eduardo tried to run to the door, but when he tried to open it, he realized it was locked. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the studio. But instead of an answer, he heard something else, a growing sound, like footsteps, but disordered and impossible to trace. They seemed to come from all directions. Eduardo fell to his knees, his hands trembling, as the space around him seemed to pulse. The studio was no longer a creative refuge. It was a prison. The disordered footsteps ceased, but the silence that followed was more oppressive than any sound. Eduardo remained kneeling, his chest rising and falling rapidly, as if the very air had become too heavy to breathe. He tried to open the door again, but the doorknob was cold and immobile, as if welded in place. Then, the voices returned all at once. They were no longer just murmurs. Each one spoke, screamed, cried, overlapping in a deafening cacophony. He recognized some of them, others were unknown, but all carried the same weight, pain and betrayal. The studio began to vibrate. The padded walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, following the rhythm of the voices. Eduardo staggered to the piano and clung to it, but the keys began to play by themselves. It wasn't a melody. It was a chaotic sound, as if the piano itself was screaming. He tried to cover his ears, but there was no escape. The voices were inside him. "Confess," they said in unison, with a tone so cold it made his hairs stand on end. "I don't know what you want," he shouted, his voice breaking from the tension. "You know," a louder voice replied, clear and distinct. It was Andre's. The piano stopped playing, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Eduardo felt the weight of hundreds of invisible eyes upon him. In the center of the room, where there had once been a pile of notebooks, now sat an old tape recorder. Its red light blinked, like a mechanical heart beating in the dark. "Record," Andre said. Eduardo hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. He picked up the recorder with trembling hands and pressed the record button. The words came out with difficulty. He began with the small eyes, the missteps that could be forgiven. But the voices wouldn't let him stop. They demanded more. "I stole from Andre. I sabotaged his music. He lost everything because of me." The environment around him began to tremble, but the voices were silent now, as if waiting. Eduardo continued, revealing his worst secrets, each one laden with shame and regret. When he finished, the recorder shut off by itself. The red light went out, and the studio was completely silent. But the relief was brief. The walls began to crack, and the floor seemed to give way beneath his feet. Eduardo ran to the door, which finally opened, revealing the dark night. He escaped from the studio, staggering, and fell to his knees on the sidewalk. Behind him, the studio was silent, but intact. Eduardo stood on the sidewalk for minutes, staring at the studio door. The place seemed unchanged, as if the chaos from moments ago had never happened. But he knew something had shifted within himself and in that space. His body was exhausted, his muscles trembling, but his mind seemed lighter, as if part of the burden he had carried had been lifted. He looked at the recorder still in his hands. The tape inside was filled with his confessions. Eduardo knew he couldn't just erase them or hide them. The weight of that truth was now his to bear. In the following days, Eduardo tried to return to his routine. He sat at the piano, but nothing came. It was as if the talent that had once flowed through his hands had disappeared along with the voices. The silence, which had once been an ally in his creative process, was now unbearable. He decided to quit music. He stopped answering calls and ignored requests for new work. The recording he had made was sent anonymously to some of the people involved in his confessions, accompanied by handwritten apologies. Despite this, Eduardo found no peace. The memories still haunted him, But now, without the voices to guide him, they seemed disordered, fragmented. He began to believe that the studio had allowed him to live, but only on the condition that he never forget what he had done. Months later, while walking through the city on a cold night, Eduardo saw a for sale sign on the facade of his old studio. He stopped and stared at the building for a long time. The dark windows seemed to look back at him, as if they recognized him. A new memory struck him, but this time it was something he had never seen before. It was Andre's face smiling, but with eyes filled with tears. "You still have time," he heard the voice echo in his mind, soft but firm. Not knowing whether it was a warning or a second chance, Eduardo walked away from the studio, not looking back. The following week, the place was bought by a young, aspiring musician.